Chapter 8 deals with political parties. This is our last chapter of new material in the course. So we're going to finish our material this semester by looking at the political parties. And in the United States, the two major political parties have probably never been stronger. Understand, I mean this in a certain sense. Back 100 years ago, 120 years ago, maybe the political parties were stronger in the sense of organizing behavior at a local level. Perhaps being part of a political machine was more critical in times past. But as a organizing feature of American democracy, as something that helps people calculate how they're going to vote in elections, I'm making the case that the parties are very strong and that people are very politically or partisanship oriented today. A large majority of the voters identify themselves as partisans and they vote that way. In the past, a lot of people have been partisans or claimed membership in parties, but you see in times such as the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that it did not really structure how people voted in Congress or in their private lives. So you might ask, what do we mean by political parties? What is the nature of political parties in the United States? And so I list here several of the things that political parties do, such as recruit and train leaders, foster political participation, teach new citizens democratic habits and practices, but also other ideas that you might look at. And the argument of this chapter is that they make democracy possible. Without political parties, a representative democracy no longer has this linkage between the mass public and the leaders, because the mass public doesn't always understand which of the political figures are aligned, whereas collective responsibility can be met out at political leaders by their membership in political parties, and people can begin to see a relationship between their votes and how political outcomes occur. So one of the great things about the party label is how it helps us enforce collective responsibility. So party labels offer a shorthand cue that keeps voting decisions cheap and simple. If you think about a world in which the only costs of voting really are registering to vote, somehow getting yourself to the polls, and then figuring out how to vote, political parties save about 1/3 of all of our effort, right? If you know how you're supposed to vote, then it just becomes a matter of, well, can I get somebody to drive me? Can I drive? Can I get there? Did I remember that I wanted to vote 30 days ago so that I could register? So you're not always going to be right if you just vote for the person who belongs to the political party that you do or associates with the political party that you do, but it works a lot. Maybe it works 80% of the time, 90% of the time. How often do you actually disagree with people who are politically aligned with you? If it's a lot, then your cost of deciding how you're going to vote is high. But if you think about it, it probably is not very often. And it would also explain why people who are associated and closely aligned, strong partisans, turn out at really high rates, while people who are independents turn out at lower rates. Because if you're an independent, using the party queue becomes much more difficult to you. Parties also more accurate are able to allow us to say, hey, if a politician is not doing what we hope he would do, if he's not acting as a member of his party would, then if we are a member of that party, we can punish that activity by not voting for him. But if we are a member of the other party, we might have less animosity toward him for doing that. And it might also just obscure in our mind just which party he belongs to. So now candidates have a trade-off, right? If you are deciding that you're going to be a politician, oftentimes you're going to have to align with one of the parties if you hope to win. And that's going to cause you to have to sacrifice a little bit in what your preference is. You're going to have to go along with your party sometimes when you wouldn't otherwise do that. But the payoff is that you get credit collectively. Now, on the other hand, the flip side of that is that when people are dissatisfied with your party, they're going to blame you. Now, we have here something that's a little bit of value added. It's not in the textbook, but it's something that you're expected to know and be aware of. Really, when we talk about mass political parties in the United States, we're thinking about three different concepts of what a political party is, and they're melded together by the mass political party. And so now a nice little mnemonic for that I've created here is pig, po, pie, which I imagine to be, one of those, like Marie Callender pot pies, right? And in it you have like pork and celery and carrots and a little bit of the sauce, and you put it in the oven and you bake it, and it's just delicious. So what are the constituent parts of the pig po pie as the mnemonic for a mass political party? Well, the mass political party connects three things: the party and government, the pig, right? Party and government. And this is all of the office holders, all of the people who are holding office who associate with a political party, who need to work together in order to achieve the goals that they have and that collectively the party has. Now, this is the oldest conception of political party in the United States. When we talk about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, we're talking about really just alliances within the government. The big innovation, Andrew Jackson's innovation, along with Martin Van Buren and the other founders of the Democratic Party, was to bring in and to allow the public to see themselves as members of this political system, as members of the political party. Now, Jackson and Van Buren, they did this in large part by having a system of giving jobs to people or to relatives of people who were associated with the political party. But in the United States today, this is the group of people who apply these political labels we've been talking about to help them make decisions in elections. So the party and the electorate is composed of the voters who identify with the party and regularly vote for its nominees. A mass political party, really the part that Van Buren brings, right? Jackson is this great leader who people want to follow because he's a war hero and he's a larger than life figure. And but in addition to that, you have these more functionary type people who understand that you need to have this party organization. And the party organization is a group of people who work because they're dedicated to electing the party's candidates. And so what do? They run interference between the party and the electorate and the party and government. They motivate the electorate and they organize the behavior of the party and government. It's the pot, I guess, in the pot pie, right? The party and government is linked to the electorate through the party organization. And you should be proud. This is an American innovation. Now, the American political system is actually designed to facilitate two-party competition, not multi-party competition, not one-party competition, but specifically a two-party system. We have something called the first past the post system, or the plurality system for voting, where one person per district wins and any other number of people lose an election. Most modern democracies have more than two parties, often because of the political system that they have. So if you operate in an electoral system that's called a plurality system, as most states do. Remember, we actually in Georgia have a majority system. The majority system being that if nobody receives a majority of the vote in an election, we have a runoff election. But in most of the country, and the majority system is just a modification of the plurality system anyway. Only one person per district wins. Well, if you have more than two people running, when only one person can win, that third person running has a tendency to split some of the opposition vote. Think about three candidates and imagine that the members of the two major parties are divided. They're not exactly the same. There's some difference between them in their policy preferences. And then you have a third person. No matter where you place that third person running for office, a vote for that third person will tend to lower the level of support for the candidate who's running, who's most like that third candidate. So if, for instance, if for instance you look at the 2016 election, what did we see? We saw an election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Now, I don't know what you believe to be the chief organizing feature of that election, but one of the questions of the election was, would we be willing to make a dramatic change? People in the country maybe were feeling that after the Obama years, it was time to make a change. Where the other question was Donald Trump the type of person who you might want to have be President of the United States? Well, if you were worried about Hillary Clinton and you voted for one of the other candidates, you lowered the number of votes that Hillary Clinton needed to get to win the election. However, if you didn't want Donald Trump because you thought maybe he didn't have the temperament to be President of the United States, and instead you voted for Gary Johnson or you voted for Jill Stein, then you were lowering the number of votes that the actual winner needed to win. So let's say, for instance, we believe that a candidate isn't capable of getting 50% of the vote. But is he capable of getting 48% of the vote or 46% of the vote? Well, the more people who vote for third-party candidates, the third-party candidates never win. But the number of people who are necessary for the winner to win is lowered by however many people split off to vote for the third-party candidate. So in the end, neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump received half of the vote. And because of, and it makes you wonder who would have won if those third-party candidates had been forced out of the race and the voters had been forced to choose between the two candidates who had the best chance of winning. Now, other systems take into account the interests of voters for third parties much differently than the American political system does. An alternative to our system is proportional representation. In a proportional representation system, rather than paying attention just to the number of votes that are enough to win a single district, a pure proportional representation system doesn't have districts. Instead, they take the percentage of the vote that each of the political parties win. Usually there's a minimum threshold, like 3% or 4% or 5%, depending on the country. But for all the parties that reach that threshold, they're guaranteed a certain amount of representation in their parliament. And then beyond that, the proportion of all of the votes of representation in the parliament is determined by how many people or what percentage of the people voted for that political party. So for instance, if 50% of the people vote for one political party, that political party will get half of the representation in the parliament, their legislative branch. So, how would that work? Well, in the United States, if one political party gets 50% and another political party gets 47% and a third party gets 3%, in every district in America, the party with 50% of the vote wins. They would win 435 members of the House of Representatives. That never happens because in the American system, not every region of the country agrees politically. However, in a proportional representation system, if one side got 50% and another had 47 and a third had 3, well then half of Congress would be the party that had 50%, and the second party would have 47% and the third party would have 3%. Well, if the second and third party could work together, they might be able to block, or they would be able to block that the party that had 50%, or let's say one less than 50% of the vote, you get a lot of coalition governments and proportional representation systems. One advantage of the American system is somebody wins. One advantage of a proportional representation system is that the collective result reflects the breakdown of the vote amongst all of the people. Now, politics in the United States has changed across time, and different people have talked about the United States having different party systems at different periods of time. One person, John Aldrich, in a book called Why Parties, was probably foremost in bringing this to people's attention. But if you look back at the founding of the country, you remember there was this debate between the Federalists, who were supporters of John Adams and James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and then the people who were a little bit less in favor of a centralized government. It's kind of confusing, right? Nowadays, when people talk about federalism, they're talking about states' rights and more decentralization. It gives you an idea of just how decentralized things were in the beginning, that the people who were Federalists were viewed as the people who said, well, the country should be more unified. Well, the Anti-Federalists like Thomas Jefferson. Um, anyway, that was the debate between 1790 and about 1824, was between the Federalists and the Republicans, although we call them Democratic Republicans because they're the Republicans that went on to become the Democratic Party. Well, after the 1824 election, this is the one where John Quincy Adams was elected president, even though Andrew Jackson had more of the vote and more of the electors, but not half of the electors. So Congress elected John Quincy Adams. Well, in any case, then that broke up this system. The Federalists had fallen away. Everyone had become a supporter of the Democratic Republicans. And in fact, Andrew Jackson was so angry about having lost that he went and he founded the Democratic Party, the oldest mass political party in the world. And eventually the anti-Jackson people formed the party that was called the Whigs. And the Democrats tended to win most all of those elections. They tended to control Congress most of the time. And the only time, there was only 2 times that the Whigs managed to elect one of their presidential candidates, and they were both famous and popular generals. Well, the second party system was working pretty well for the Democrats, but it fell apart over the debate over slavery and sectionalism. The Whigs, being the weaker of the party, fell apart first. The Democrats, their falling apart actually is what helped precipitate the Civil War occurring when it did. And when the Whigs fell apart, many of the Whigs, especially the ones who had been anti-slavery, gravitated toward the Republican Party. Several other groups, the Know-Nothings, which were a nativist party that was also very anti-slavery, and the abolitionists, all formed and coagulated together as the Republican Party that won the 1860 election. The Democrats had split apart into a northern, a southern, and then a sort of compromise group called the Constitutional Union Party. And those parties, those 3 Democratic parties lost to Abraham Lincoln, even though he only had about 40% of the vote. Well, the Republican Party in the third party system became dominant. They won the Civil War. In the South, the Democrats stayed powerful, but in the North, the Northerners hated the South and they viewed the Republicans as their party. In the South, the Democrats hated the North and they viewed the Democrats as their party. And this lasted until about 1894, where the Civil War was the main issue of the day. But the fourth party system comes about with the debate over progressivism. And in fact, the Republican Party during the fourth party system was so dominant that only when they split and couldn't agree between their more conservative and their more progressive groups did the Democrats win. In fact, if you look at the third and fourth party systems at the same time, you see a time when we only had 2 elected Democratic presidents between the end of the Civil War and the Great Depression. Now, the fifth party system is formed around the time of the Great Depression. What do we see? We see a change in sides as many people who had depended on the Republican Party and the growth of industry and railroads and things to help the development and the Industrial Revolution and such in the United States. The people switched sides to support the Democrats because they viewed that the Republicans had let them down with the Great Depression. And Franklin Roosevelt does a really good job during this time of bringing together a lot of groups who tended to disagree with each other. The fifth party system, when did the fifth party system fall apart, is a matter of great debate in American politics. And so some people say it fell apart in 1968 when you started to have people be upset at the high crime rates and sort of the disillusion within society related to the Vietnam War. You started to see a falling apart of the dominance of American industry, which had come to fore in the aftermath of World War II. So some people talk about 1968, when Richard Nixon won, as being the beginning of the end of this dominant New Deal or fifth party system. Other people say, yes, Nixon won, but that could have been an outlier, and that the real end of the fifth party system was maybe in 1980, when Ronald Reagan won 2 large landslide victories and actually was able for the first time to have Republicans take over the Senate for the first time since the beginning of the fifth party system. And still other people say that it lasted all the way till 1994, when the Republicans were able to take over Congress again for the first time since the 1950s, and for 2 times in a row for the first time since the 1920s. So anyway, we are definitely out of the fifth party system now. And in retrospect, we might even be out of the sixth party system. The sixth party system arguably was this period between 1968 and maybe 2008, when the Republicans tended to win more than they lost, and the Democrats tended to be in control of Congress more, with the Republicans in charge of the presidency more. But if we're in a new party system, what is it? Well, certainly we see a time when between 2000 and 2016, the Republicans have won their share of elections, right? The Republicans have won 3 out of the last 5 presidential elections and have controlled at least one of the houses of Congress for most of the time since 1994. But we also see a time where the Republicans have only won 1 out of 5 times have they won the popular vote for president. So I think we see a party system of a very big divide, an urban-rural divide, or maybe a blue state, red state divide. That if you look at the elections back in the time of Clinton or George H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan or even Richard Nixon, that quite often presidential candidates would win huge landslides, 40 states, 30-some states, or even 2 times presidential candidates had won 49 out of 50 states. And we don't get that anymore. We have a much more divided country. So we're probably in a 7th party system now, although we'll leave to the historians to make some of those conclusions. So I'll just very briefly touch on a couple things. You should look at the idea of party conventions. One of the things that the Democratic Party did when they formed in the 1830s was they said that we're going to bring together party leaders from all over the country into a giant convention, And those conventions will decide who our presidential candidates are. And this was an innovation because before the people had no say. Now they have a lot of say. But over time, people started to see that as anti-democratic. And now we see that the presidential primaries are decisive. To this point, we have. We'll see. Put a little bookmark in this statement. I wonder whether Joe Biden will end up being the Democratic nominee for president. Certainly, he won the nomination in the primaries, but conventions technically decide. But conventions as the decider have been argued to be obsolete because almost all of the candidates almost all of the delegates to the national conventions go to the conventions having promised to vote for one of the candidates. This is really a decision that was made back in the 1970s. Prior to that, almost all of the delegates went to the convention and were allowed to vote their conscience. Really, what conventions tend to be is opportunities. I should, instead of saying in 2008, both party conventions became venues for patching up different divisions. Since at least then, we've always had some division between within the parties that needs to be patched up. People who are fighting over some issue. I would imagine that in the 2020 convention, if we actually hold it face to face, that we're going to see that we're going to see a strong effort for the Democrats to bring together the supporters of Bernie Sanders with the supporters of Joe Biden, because they don't always see things eye to eye. The Republicans in 2016 worked really hard to paper over the differences between the supporters of people like Ted Cruz or John Kasich and Donald Trump. As I said before, we might even be in a seventh party system now. Maybe a sixth party system, maybe a seventh party system. We'll see. Certainly we see that partisanship endures. That partisanship has greatly expanded since the 1970s, and that partisanship becomes more closely aligned with how people actually stand on the issues. Now, I've posted here a list of differences between the supporters of each of the parties, or what the parties stand for. In some ways, this is a great simplification. I don't think you'll be asked to know any of these particulars. If there's something that stands out as not being quite so, drop me a line. But we definitely do see that there's a difference between the parties. When push comes to shove, I don't know that I believe either party believes in a cheaper federal government. I think that they have their own spending priorities, though. For supporters, if we believe what Anthony Downs told us, then we don't really believe that changes in what the parties believe is half as important as changes in who are the people who are in the parties. And the coalitions have definitely changed. The party coalitions today, I guess, still have strong traces of the New Deal alignment. Unions, minorities, people who live in large cities still tend to be Democrats. People who are more rural, people who run small businesses tend to be much more likely to be Republicans. Probably the crucial changes that we've seen since the time in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s when the Democrats dominated politics to now when you have much more balance, is we see that white Southerners went from being Democrats to typically being Republicans, and that African Americans who had been prior to the New Deal had been excluded by the Democratic Party have now become the most loyal stalwarts of the Democratic Party. So when we're face to face, we have a little discussion here at the end about what I mean by expediency persisting. And what I mean by expediency persisting, as I tell people, and sometimes students agree and sometimes they disagree, is that people need political parties because people need to be able to not dedicate their entire lives to politics, but still draw conclusions about how they should vote that are rational, that are useful, so that they vote for essentially the right people to promote the side that they're on or the beliefs that they have. And so voters don't always like to admit that they're members of a political party or that they're followers of a political party, but it's rational that they would be. And that people who run parties have worked very hard to design the party to be a clearinghouse for those beliefs, so that when you run a campaign, there's buzzwords and terms and ways of thinking that are consistent with a political party, so that you can present your campaign in the very best way with the best chance of winning in light of the support and the structured support of so many of the voters. All right, so this is what we have for chapter 12. It ended up taking me about 40 minutes. I suppose that makes sense, since I usually cover this in about one class session. I wish you all well. Make sure that you've watched the video update where we'll talk about some of the things that you'll need to know in order to complete the rest of the class successfully. Thank you.